The one thing we always want to make sure of is to acknowledge the land that we are on. So Global Sport Matters, which is a part of the Global Sport Institute and ASU, sits on the ancestral lands of the Pima and Maricopa peoples. So we just want to recognize the lands that we are on, that we are broadcasting from. And with that, we want to go into the show, which is actually inspired by the field study that we have put together. And this is all a part of our newest Global Sport Matters issue on the reset of college sport. We are dropping in the chat the link to our newest issue, which you guys get a first look at. It has wonderful stories from many different folks, as well as a podcast, our newest podcast episode with Coach John Beam, who, if you're familiar with the Netflix series Last Chance U, he's from Laney College. We sat down with him, talked to him about not only being a college coach right now with COVID coming back safely, making sure that his players are supported, but you think about the wildfires that are going on across the western half of our country, and what does that mean for the future of college sport when you think about climate change? So tune in. We have wonderful stories, lots of really interesting articles in that issue, but I won't take any more time. I'm going to turn it over to our host, Professor Kenneth Shropshire. Please take it away.
Thank you, Kendall, and welcome everyone. This is something we started doing at the beginning of the pandemic when we were trying to figure out how do you hold events in this moment that we're in. Do make sure that you, if you comment on social media, use the hashtag Global Sport Matters, hashtag Global Sport Matters. And if you got any questions, do jump into the chat, and we will get those questions answered as best we can. I do want to say, I mean, I know the panelists all very well, Richard Lapchick and I, and Keith Harrison, and then my colleague Karen Gallagher in this first segment. I mean, this is a difficult day, and I don't think we should begin without acknowledging the absence of homicide charges against the officers in the Breonna Taylor case. It's just a sad continuation, and I know in the work that, especially that Richard does, that Keith and I do, and Karen has spoken loudly, especially against violence that's occurred to women in the military. So I just don't want the people that are tuning in to not know that it's heavy on our hearts as we do this. And certainly any of the panelists, if that's what's on your heart, you want to talk about something related to that, please do. It is trying in this work, and I'm so happy to have Richard here, who is kind of the godfather of doing this kind of work in this space. And I'm sure at moments he's had the same thought, and I know he has focused a lot on other issues in later years. What's the value of doing the sports work? I mean, sometimes you do catch yourself. I look at this brother who's the attorney general in Kentucky, and I say, well, if I had that job, I think I may have been able to come up with a different outcome. Is that maybe a space where I could have had a bigger impact than what I'm doing here? Again, I wasn't in the room with the brother, but it's just disheartening to see the kind of outcome and his delivery of what the outcome was. But our work today is to focus on college sports and the reset of college sports. And initially, we're going to talk about a field study that we did, looking at the hiring of head coaches in Power 5 conferences. And Karen Gallagher, my colleague, is going to give us the insight on that. And then I'm going to ask Richard next to talk some about kind of the history of doing these things and why we do them. And then Keith, who's a kind of a utility player, is going to talk about a couple of different issues related that I'll get to. But Karen, if you could start us off, please.
Yeah, and thank you, Ken, for taking a moment to acknowledge the significance of that decision to not prosecute. the murderers of Breonna Taylor. So I appreciate you bringing that up. It's important to note it today. So I just wanted to say that before I kind of jumped into why we're here. And so this slide here kind of shows you this big snapshot of hiring diversity within NCAA Power 5 head coaches. So we kind of wanted to take a look at what does leadership look like in college coaching. And this snapshot, although it shows you some variability, you can see the greatest gain in 10 seasons when we just look at the bookends, 2009-10 season versus 2018-19 season. When we compare those, you can see the greatest gains were in the hiring of white coaches. But we didn't really feel like this told the entire story, right? It gives you this bird's eye view kind of a snapshot, but there's a lot that happened between these years, and there's a lot more variables to look at when we think about how does the hiring continue to look like this? How is it that in this day, the greatest gain is with white coaches? And so we wanted to consider a lot of factors, including playing experience. We wanted to consider coaching experience. We wanted to consider regions. What does this look like? And so if we could kind of move to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about the playing experience of the coaches. And again, this is just the coaches that were hired between that 2009-10 season and 2018-19 season. And while the bulk of the coaches that were hired in these Power 5 conferences, most of them came from previous college coaching experiences or college playing experience. You can see that for coaches of color, more of them played in the NFL, and none of them came from a background where they didn't have significant playing experience. So becoming a head coach wasn't possible unless you had significant playing experience if you were a coach of color. Whereas for white coaches, you had a lot more, a lot more pathways to this, including not having any significant playing experience at all. So when we look here at this slide where we've kind of broken it down regionally, you can see all of the conferences within the NCAA Power 5. And we've got so many conferences with way too many teams who have never, ever hired a head coach of color. I mean, look at the SEC. 64% of the teams in the SEC have never hired a head coach of color. That's too many. We're not suggesting there is an ideal number, but that number's too high. That percentage is too high. And even when you look at the Pac-12 is better, but still a fourth of the teams in the Pac-12, a quarter of them have never hired a head coach of color. None of these conferences have, whatever the ideal is, this isn't it. None of them have numbers of teams that have, all of whom have hired head coaches of color. We're just not seeing that across any of these conferences.
Thanks, Karen. So this was a real collaboration in some ways. Dr. Lapchick has collected this data through his racial report cards over the years. And we reached out to him and Keith Harrison and asked Keith if he could help us compile that data. Dr. Lapchick, I do want to ask you that general question. When you first started doing this, why and what impact did you hope to have when you began to, in this specific piece of your work, when you began to accumulate this data?
I actually wrote the first racial and gender report card, not calling it that, as part of a book that I had written. And when it was published, the Sports Illustrated reviewer complained that I was talking about things that didn't really matter, that sports was an equal playing field. Why was I pointing these hiring practices out? And I decided that I wanted to do it even more systematically, and we started finally in 1988 to show the American public, who I think generally at that stage looked at sports and saw who was playing sports and thought that was sports. They didn't look behind the scenes very much. They didn't look at who the general managers or even managers or coaches, let alone all the people who work in the front office or a league office. And when we started to do it, I know that we were a thorn in the side of the various league offices, and they weren't really happy about it. But over the years, I think now the league offices all use it as a kind of bully pulpit to go to the teams, because the league offices all do fairly well for hiring both women and people of color. But at the team level is where the problem is, and at the college level, it's the worst of all, as this study points out. And if you don't mind my adding on to what you started with, commenting on the current situation, this is a horrible, another moment, racial moment in our country's history, but the Washington Post just published a story a couple of hours ago that in the last year, 1,010 people were shot and killed by the police. That since 2015, 5,000 people have been shot and killed by the police. That in 2019, there were only 27 days in America where someone wasn't shot or killed by a policeman in their city. It's a huge, huge issue that we barely scratched the surface of. And I didn't want to distract from the discussion of what the topic is here today, but this is of the moment. So I hope you don't mind my doing that.
Oh, no, very much appreciate it. And it is, and all of us that do this work, we know it's all intertwined.
Yeah.
When we talked about taking your work and trying to tie it all together and do more synthesizing with it, it is some of the great work that's been done in other fields. The shape of the river. Where does this all come from? How do we get to the mouth of the river? How do we correct the course in a way to address all these issues? So where having diverse coaches sits on the pantheon of problems, I don't know, but it's all part of that river and when it stops in there.
Well, it's something I think the general public can talk about more readily than they can talk about racism and systemic racism and the history of slavery. And they can grasp how few Black coaches there are in college sport and talk about that as football fans, whereas they might not be able to get into the depth of racism in America right away.
It's an access point. Keith, as you look at this data in the couple of minutes that we have, what are your reflections on where we are and any thoughts on where we've been?
Sure. I mean, and the data speak to this. Thank you all for having me. I think when we talk about the similarities versus the differences, the similarities are race and barriers to upward mobility. That's true in college and professional level. At the college level, it's funny to listen to Dr. Lapchick say, well, it's not funny, but it's just interesting that it's worse at the college level, but there's more teams. We have 32 teams, but over time, usually, not that it's equitable, but the NFL coaches of color have tended to have as many or more opportunities. So I think what's interesting is something Karen pulled out of the data. If you look at this phenomenon of pathways, white coaches get in on the ground level. Many of them have played D3, D2, NAIA. I mean, I don't want to pick on people, but I mean, you look at Matt Patricia, at Rensselaer, and they don't have, it's like Dr. Harry Edwards says that for us to get opportunity to coach or to be in the booth, I'm broadening out to answer your question, we have to have 5 Super Bowl rings or championship rings. And, you look at TNT to move it. In that context, you got Ernie Johnson, Barkley, Kenny Smith, and Shaq. And so that phenomenon happens at the collegiate level as well as the pro. And I guess my final response is, why is it that the Black athletes who had all the visibility can't start out at any level and have success, whereas the white coaches haven't had that playing experience and they get those opportunities?
We're gonna bring everybody back in the last segment, but I want to add to that Keith, and I think about that, and it's a difficult thing to say because so you and me, and you too, Doctor. So many of our friends are former players, but it is even the new president of Washington Football Club, a former player. I mean that has to be in the background, and most of the time, especially if you look at the early days of baseball managers, for example, you had to be a Hall of Famer. I mean, you had to be an exceptional player, but the idea that you can hire a head coach in these different levels that has never played the game. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that the qualifications are different for one group versus another. So let me thank these panelists. We're going to go to a poll real quick and bring everybody back. So if you guys tune out, and Kendall will come guide us through the poll.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have a quick poll before we move into our second segment. And I'm going to launch it right here while I ask the question aloud. Do you think the financial forces, boosters, donors, sponsors, TV networks can bring about change like we saw with the Washington team? So you heard a very quick snapshot of obviously the wider issue, not only as it's reflected in sports, but across, our country and the world. But thinking about, how do we really push for change? So this was something that obviously we saw. Ken, you mentioned Washington team there, FedEx and other sponsors really who hold the purse strings, saying enough is enough. All right, so we will give this a couple more seconds there. All right, let's end this poll. All right, let's share these results. All right, so the question, do you think the financial forces can bring about change like we saw with the Washington team? Overwhelmingly, everybody's very hopeful that yes. So that kind of gives us a bit of a road there forward. So Ken, take it away.
Thank you. So I guess the question is they can, but will they? And that's really what we want to look at in this next segment, is to give some thought to what's really happening in terms of head coaches, in terms of leadership in this space. And we've got, adding to this panel, we've got Keith Harrison coming back. And then I also want to bring in Dr. Fitzhill, who was both a Division I head coach at San Jose State University. I don't hold that against him. He's a Stanford man. They always upset us. And then went on to be, in the most unusual path, to be the president of Arkansas Baptist. So we'll be able to talk to him about that as well. Fitz, why don't you just tell us, speaking of the shape of the river, how did you get there? Let's start with the head coach job. How did you get there? It's there's, and Keith, maybe you got the exact number, but it's, you can almost do it on your hands and toes in terms of the numbers that have been at that level, in terms of especially African Americans, if we take out our Latinx brothers. So Fitz, how'd you get there?
Well, thank you, and Ken and Keith, it's always good to be with you. Dr. Lapchick, he mentioned his study that really, the woke moment, as I call it. I actually read that study in 1988 as a graduate assistant at Northwestern State University, and it changed the way I looked at everything. And I really started analyzing my whole situation. I didn't know Dr. Lapchick, but that study was an awakening moment for me to think back about, man, I never had a black head football coach coming in high school. I had one black coach in high school. At Ouachita Baptist University, there were no black assistant coaches. And then I was on the staff at Northwestern, and we had 2 black GAs and no black assistant coaches. So from that point on, I just started researching. That became my thesis, became my dissertation, and I started saying, what is the pathway? And so I used that data to help me try to create, the game plan to become a head football coach. And I realized one thing that I said, okay, to be better, there was this stereotypical perception of African-American coaches. So I said, how am I going to make myself stand out to be evaluated differently? Well, I'll be honest with you. That's the reason I got a doctorate degree, because I realized black coaches are evaluated collectively and white coaches are evaluated individually. So we're, as an ethnic person, you're always grouped into that whole ethnicity thing. And I said, how am I going to distinguish and separate myself? Well, that's when I reached out to Dr. Lapchick. I attached myself onto him academically in the early 90s as I started collecting data and started doing things. And I started saying, okay, I know how you look at me, but I'm not going to let you look at me this way. I'm going to give you something else to look at. You know, I guess in a way, I'm gonna have to be an anomaly, because you think of me as this way, but I'm gonna make you look at me this way. And I'm gonna have the data to be able to do that. But football as a way of coaching, you know, you have to make first downs, you have to win. And, you know, I attached myself to other head coaches. Coach Ken Hatfield gave me an opportunity as a graduate assistant coach. But at that time, you know, there was only one black guy on the staff, Larry Brinson, and I had roomed with him on the road. I didn't have money as a graduate assistant, but he let me sleep on his floor in Nashville, Louisiana. All right, Nashville, Tennessee, as a graduate assistant, because I had no money, and I met him then, and through another coach, and then he had an opening at University of Arkansas. He called me and said, "You interested in being a GA? It only pays $50 a month." And I said, "Can I go to grad school? You know, you pay for my school, I'll go." You know, and so because number one, I want to study, you know, communications in grad school, because I realized this was more important to me than money. From that point on, you know, I was able to meet Jack Crow and the relationships. And I think it's so important for black coaches to understand, and for all coaches really, but for black coaches specifically. It's just like in education. Number one predictor for academic success in the classroom is not literacy, it's not your ACT score, it's a relationship with the teacher. If you got a relationship, you're gonna have a chance to learn. Well, that's the deal with black coaches. If you got a relationship, you're gonna be okay. Houston Nutt made me assistant head football coach. He empowered me. He put me in situations. And Houston's background went to Little Rock Central, grew up around ethnic minorities all his life. He said, "Hey, you got head coaching potentials." The relationship with Coach Nutt and then Coach Brawls then empowered me, which then led me to San Jose State. Now, I probably shouldn't have taken that job, as you sit here and say, because the resources were not of something that, you know, that I was used to coming from the SEC. But the data, because I knew the data so well, Ken and Key, I decided that black coaches don't get many opportunities. So how can I turn down a job? They offered me the job. So what am I gonna say? Nah, I'm gonna wait for another, when in fact there were only 3 at the time.
And Fitz, that's part of a bigger issue, probably for another conversation, is not just taking the job, which I think is very difficult not to take the job, but the idea of taking the interview too, especially in the moment. We're going to talk about the Rooney Rule some in the moment of you know, why do we have to be the ones to figure out if it's a real interview or not, and,
right?
And how that impacts your on this. Fitz.
Well, that goes back to how that happened. Well, and Kelly McGregor, okay, who was assistant athletic director at Arkansas, who I had worked for as a dorm counselor, then became the president of the Colorado Rockies. He had played for the Denver Broncos. He then became the president of the Colorado Rockies. And Chuck Bell, who had played at Colorado State, that's how I got the job, relationship, called Kelly McGregor and said, "Hey, do you know any young African-American?" Chuck Bell was looking for an African-American coach. "Do you know any young and up-and-coming African-American coach?" And Kelly McGregor said, "Fitz Hill, I worked with him at Arkansas. I was the dorm counselor now." All right. And then Dean Weber, who was a trainer, Kelly McGregor called Dean Weber, who's a trainer, and he said, "Is Fitz ready to be a head football coach?" And Dean Weber said, "I've watched Jimmy Johnson, Barry Switzer. I've watched all these guys come to the University of Arkansas. He's as ready as Jimmy Johnson or Barry Switzer was." That's how I got the job.
Well, that's what we all need. Not mentors, we need sponsors. We need
sponsors. Yeah,
I mean, across the board, not just African Americans. Everybody needs a sponsor to really get there. Keith, you've had a chance to reflect on this topic for a while. I mean, the big question that I ask beyond those of us on this webinar: who wants this change to come about? I mean, certainly people that want the coaching position, but what people in power want the change to come about? Want us to stop doing report cards and field studies and want the numbers to be more as they should be?
Well, when it comes to diversity and innovation, people want to win, as Fitz pointed out. So I'm going to be optimistic in this way. If we go back to black centers have taken over the position now. If we look at black quarterbacks, if everyone's not watching, and I'll say this, you don't have to be black to play quarterback and now have, quote unquote, taken it over. But Aaron Rodgers, Josh Allen. If you can't run, throw, and think, you're not going to be playing the position. Look at the college level. It's unreal. So when those in power decide that our brains matter just as much as our back pedal and that they can win, it will change. I want to address something good friend Dr. Hill said. I want to disagree slightly, just slightly. He said that blacks are held individually accountable and whites are individuals and we're collective. That's true, but whites are also collective because they can reshuffle whether they win or lose. They don't fall the day to show the way we do. So, you know, if you take as a case study, I'm going to pick on Joe Judge. He had never been a coordinator. He'd never been a head coach. There's no way if you flip the races and have Joe Judge be black and you make somebody else white like Eric Bieniemy, there's no way Bieniemy wouldn't have had the head job. There's no way that's going to happen. And I want to take this time to add on the broader systemic racist ideology. I want everyone out there in the world to think about if 3 black cops rolled up in the house and shot a 26-year-old white female, would the 3 cops get off? No way on earth.
Keith, thank you. And Fitz, let's close out this segment with this question to you, the role of the college president in this. I mean, you sat in that seat, you operated in that rarefied space, you've looked at this a lot, you engaged with the president of San Jose State. What can college presidents do to bring about this change? And if you want to critique what they have done so far, please do that as well. We'll close out with this.
Well, I think you have to be intentional. And I can say that the president of San Jose State at the time, you know, I was walking into a space that was, you know, as we call the first, you know, and that's something I'm working on right now, an essay called The First, because see, oftentimes we're affirmed and validated when we call the first, but when I think about it, is that really something we're walking into something that we'll be proud of, and so oftentimes you are going to be the first for that president. So what is he going to have to feel comfortable with you? That's something, because we got to think about the boosters, all the people that he's looking at that he has to respond to. Because let's take SMU for an example. When they got ready to hire June Jones, which he was in the WAC with me when I was the coach. June Jones came to SMU, and SMU, being an academic institution, decided to pay June Jones $2 million. Okay, well, they decided to do that how? 20 boosters pledged $100,000 a year for the period of his contract. So now, who did he work for? Did he work for the president, or did he work for the booster club? So the president has to be involved in that level to say intentional. Look, I need you to support who I'm going to hire for the strategic mission of the institution, not allowing departments to operate in a silo and the booster club decide, well, we raised this $2 million, and so we're going to hire that. So the presidents have to be intentional in creating a diverse population and be inclusive in the process and hiring the best guy. Hey, it's good business. And I've just always said, if I move to Japan, and 80% of my workforce were Japanese, why wouldn't I consider a head Japanese person to lead my organization? That's good business, you know, because listen, I may not understand the culture. I was maybe supposed to bow, but I didn't know that. But they understood that because that's my workforce. So if you want to win, and you know, and I want to make this clarification, I wasn't saying that in a holistic standpoint, but I realized what Keith was mentioning. I realized when black coaches are, San Jose State will probably never hire another black coach. Now, I'm out on the record that why? Because of my lack of success. However, his point is right. They continue to hire the white coach who's had a lack of success. So maybe I didn't frame that right, but I realized because in that situation, I was the first. And you know what Ron Brown said when he was at Brown University, when he was at Nebraska as a assistant, he went to Brown and they were considering hiring him. I write about this in Crackback. Coach Brown said, one of the persons on the committee, professors there said, we do not want to do that experiment at Brown. we're often looked at as an experiment. And if we're successful, hey, it's like a blue chip stock taking off. If we're not, I told you not to invest in that. That's kind of how the perception is. So the presidents have to be ready to withstand that flack that's going to come with us not being successful, just as what Dr. Harrison said with the white coaches who may not be as successful. So, hey, we're both unsuccessful. Let's try again. Don't make it race association, because I realize in crackback, race does define space.
So Keith, I'm gonna let you make a quick comment. Then we're gonna go bring Kendall on. She can come on now if she likes, and go to a poll. Keith.
I want everyone to think out there, and I'll promote Dr. Hill's book. If you haven't read Crackback.
You gotta read it.
Why do coaches of color get crackback, or they move the goalposts, but then white mainstream coaches, many of them, get catapulted? I want to give a shout out to think the other way. When Cliff Kingsbury was the head coach at Texas Tech, he had the most African-American assistants on his staff. Bruce Arians, defensive coordinator, offensive coordinator, Bowles and Leftwich, both black. He has more women on his staff. So we still want to side and align with white allies that have the interests of diversity and inclusion translating to good business. Just want to make that point.
And one of the important things, and Keith, you and I have talked about this, and at the Global Sport Institute, we're starting to work on it, and we want to bring in as many people who want to focus on it. The business case in sports for diversity and inclusion. I mean, so often we think we don't have to deliver that, but I think it's going to be a meaningful anchor to much of this conversation. So Fitz and Keith, you guys will be right back. Kendall's going to take us to a poll.
Thank you both. Thank you. So we've got one more audience poll before we go into our final segment here, bringing everybody back together. And this one, you know, it kind of talked about already, but really leading us into this third segment as we, again, just kind of getting into how do we really push change? What has been the model? What can we do? And so this is a question to everybody. Much like the activism in the pro level that we are seeing, could college athlete activism bring about change? So thinking about those college athletes, obviously, you know, there's a lot that's going on right now, name, image, likeness, the We Are United movement. There's so many different layers that college athletes are pushing for, and thinking about, you know, what sort of leverage do they have at this point? So a couple more seconds on there, and then we'll move in and show our results. All right, ending the poll here. Overwhelmingly, here we go. All right, so answering whether college athlete activism, much like pro level athlete activism, can it have the same amount of leverage to bring about change? Yes, believe they can. 75% of you are very optimistic, which makes me very happy. Ken, take it away.
Yeah, it is an optimistic crowd. I mean, I said no, and essentially because it's such a short lifespan in the college level. By the time you figure out you can be an activist, you're out. So, and which is a lot of the issue with unionization and otherwise. So let me bring back everybody for this final segment, and we're going to talk about finding a way forward and adding to this illustrious UCF-centric group. We're going to bring in Sam Sachs, who really has done some work that I think is undernoted. When we started putting this together, folks saying, well, you know, what about the Rooney Rule? And it's a complicated issue in some ways to think about the Rooney Rule. I'm going to ask Sam to explain the Rooney Rule and to explain the success they've had in Oregon and the complications with a Rooney Rule beyond the pro level. But Sam, welcome. If you would take us through what was House Bill 3118, a big part of your life.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. And I want to say her name, Breonna Taylor. As someone who served as a human rights commissioner, who worked in law enforcement, I'm disgusted by the outcome yesterday. And so I want to say her name, and I appreciate you bringing that up today, Breonna Taylor. We still need to seek justice for her and so many others. And so thank you for bringing that up today and letting us say her name and remember her. as far as the Rooney Rule goes, about, well, it was 2007. I had graduated from Portland State University with a degree in Black Studies. And during that time, I served with former Senator Avale Louise Gordley, who was the first Black woman elected to the Oregon Senate. And during my time working with her as an intern in the legislature, I kind of learned how the legislature works. And around 2008, 2009, I was just really irritated by the lack of hiring for minority coaches, especially at Portland State University, where Tim Walsh left our school and went to Army, and Portland State, instead of interviewing other candidates, specifically qualified minority candidates, they hired Jerry Glanville. They didn't interview anyone else. So I started doing some research, and I had heard about the Rooney Rule in the NFL, which requires that each team interview one qualified minority candidate before they hire a head coach. And I believe that was 2002, 2003 when that became policy in the NFL. So fast forward to 2009, I started doing some research and thought that I came up with a great idea for a college Rooney Rule. And so I started Googling college Rooney Rule and discovered Dr. Richard Lapchick. And the fact that Dr. Richard Lapchick actually had came up with this idea way before me or anyone else, and called it the Eddie Robinson Rule. So long story short, I reached out to him. I reached out to Dr. Floyd Keith, and I said I had an idea to put a bill through the Oregon State Legislature similar to the NFL Rooney Rule, which would make it a law in Oregon and require all state-funded universities to interview one qualified minority candidate when hiring for a head football coach. And the reason I reached out to Dr. Lapchick and Floyd Keith were two reasons. One, to get their blessing, and two, to get their help. And also Doc Harrison, who was very instrumental in the report cards, because the report cards was the information and the statistical information I used when I lobbied the state legislature and I met with all the legislators and the different House subcommittees and Senate subcommittees to explain why we needed the Rooney Rule model in Oregon. So it started out as just football head coaches, and when it went to the House Education Committee, they amended it to include all sports. So in Oregon, so short version, try to give you the condensed version, in 2009 session, House Bill 3118 passed the Senate 29-0, meaning all the senators voted for it, some of which had said they wouldn't vote for it. And now, and at that time, Oregon became the first place in the country outside of the NFL, anytime they hire a head coach or athletic director for swimming, basketball, volleyball, Oregon State, Portland State have to interview at least one qualified minority candidate before they hire for that position. And since then, we've seen the first Black head football coach at Oregon. In fact, the last two head football coaches in Oregon have been minorities. So first time in the history of that organization, that school, the first Black track coach at the University of Oregon, the first Black woman athletic director in the state's history at Portland State University, the first Black athletic director at Western Oregon. And so we've had a lot of successes in just in the last 10 years. Every school is on board now with making sure they interview. A few of them have violated the policy, but you know, for the most part, they've been on board. And I just want to stop there and give you an opportunity to interject.
Yeah, no, we appreciate that. I think a lot of people viewing don't know the whole history and where the Rooney Rule came in. And Fitz, I want to go to you in a moment and ask about what you think the impact of a rule like that would be across the country. But Dr. Lapchick, you know, you've thought about all these issues over the years. You know, fighting apartheid in South Africa via sport, and the idea of legislation to change behavior, and the idea of I mean, the Rooney Rule within the NFL is just a rule. I mean, it's something that is a private enterprise that they decide to do. But you know, as Sam was talking, I'm thinking about all the changes we want to try to make in this country, and the big changes in this country have been big pieces of civil rights legislation. I mean, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, 63, 64, 65. Richard, have you seen, can you envision something bigger happening than a state by state movement? Could you envision that there could be some version of broader federal legislation at the college level, the most problematic space that we're looking at?
Well, I have been trying to get the NCAA to adopt the Robinson Rule since the early in this century. Total resistance.
It's terrible to reference it as early in the century now, but yeah.
Thank goodness for Sam stepping up in Oregon, and I'm sure you probably read that a couple of weeks ago the West Coast Conference adopted what they're calling the Russell Rule, named after Bill Russell. It's the same thing. Right. And we're working on a conference by conference level I'm having conversations with 3 Power 5 conferences now to adopt a similar rule. But I think that the precedent of the graduation rate publication is a good example. The NCAA said our members would never support publication of graduation rates in the 1970s and 1980s, although we were pushing for it. And then Senator Bradley and Tom McMillan helped the US Congress pass legislation, the Student Athlete Right to Know Act, and suddenly the NCAA was publishing graduation rates a month later. The last thing they want is governmental intervention. So I think when we can get governmental intervention, it will move things. But I think the biggest thing that will move things right now is the answer to the question that your poll addressed before, is athlete activism. I think this is, 4 years ago when Colin took a knee, I think he was basically disapproved by most of the American public. Now it's 80% of the American public, according to a recent Nielsen study, support athlete activism, support teams and leagues supporting the athletes, and ask brands to fight for social change. This is a huge shift, I think, in public attitude, and it was taken during the racial reckoning, so that obviously had a big influence. But this is a moment that I think I've never been in my lifetime. I think I'm the oldest one here, so probably applies to everybody. But I think we have an opportunity here to do more things than we ever could have before. And if we don't seize the moment, shame on us.
Fitz, legislation replacing, well, I guess as a supplement to networking. The idea that, as Sam described, it mandates that you got to have a person of color be allowed to enter the room. Is that moment of entering a room enough networking to get you over the hump to maybe get the job?
I want to say, after doing 25 years of research, I actually thought in 2011, when my book went to be published, we had 17 black head football coaches in the NCAA Division I at that time. So in 2012, I said 2020, crackback may be irrelevant. That was my thought process in thinking the progress we made, as we were approaching 2010, 2011, 17. And today, to look at the demise, Mark and I use the NFL as a pattern to the diversity we were seeing back in 2009 and 10, when we had 7, 8, 9 black coaches, and the percentage-wise they were relative at the time as we were approaching 2012. I never thought we would be here today. I'm telling you, I didn't think we would have regressed, but I realized why. Because you have so many programs that never had a black coach before, and we're still saying we're still saying we have to do legislation to do what should be right, that we have to mandate it to be done, that we have to make legislation make me be inclusive in the process. And I'm gonna tell you why I think that is. And many people call it the Obama effect in many ways, that it happened in 2011 and 2012 and 2014, when Coach Sumlin was hired at Texas A&M, and in 2014, Coach Strong was hired at Texas. Guys, that was the first time in 2015 that not one black coach was hired. Why? Because we got comfortable. We got comfortable in thinking that we had reached that plateau. And when you have blue blood programs like Texas A&M, who had hired Kevin Sumlin, and Texas now had hired Charlie Strong, everybody, it all went away. So in 2015, I'm sitting there, and I was actually at the University of Texas talking to his staff because I have several friends, Coach Robinson, Vance Bedford. I'm sitting there in Texas. I took my son to Coach Strong football camp, and they were talking about what was going on. I said, do y'all realize in 2015, I'm proud of you all being here. This is a milestone for Coach Strong to be at Texas. Y'all realize not one black coach was hired this year? That was the first time. So what Dr. Lapchick is saying, we have to keep this on the front burner. And I never thought that. So I just talked to Mark Purdy, who helped me write the book. I said, Mark, we have to do a crackback post-game 10-year report, 2022. I said, we have to, because how did we go back? How did this allow to happen? So I'll be honest with you, Dr. Shropshire, I'm appalled and I really don't know. And that's what I want to study. Why did this happen? You know, because we would think right now that if people were doing the right things, you know, it's kind of like education though, and being in education, looking at underserved populations of people, integration, the civil rights laws, the Brown versus Board of Education, it allowed us in the door. But look, you can make a person let you sit next to them, but you can't make a person love you. You can't make a person accept you. And so I think, you know, as Dr. King said, we got in the house, but it's burning. So I think we got to look at what we've allowed ourselves to come to and realize, you know, we have to be very strategic in understanding, man, if we don't talk about this, I quit talking about it. I'm just now getting back in, remotivated to bring this topic back up. I didn't think crackback was needed anymore. But now people calling me all the time said, do you realize no black coaches are being hired? 3 in NFL? That's problematic. So I wish I could tell you an answer, Dr. Shropshire, but I'm gonna study that over the next 24 months to come out with what happened that we regressed from the progress that we made, that 17 coaches in 2011, in 2015, not one. That's a problem.
There's a great short story, Fitz, by Derek Bell, late Derek Bell, one of the founders of the critical race theory, critical legal studies movement, and it's called the Chronicle of the Divine Gift. And the whole focus of that, I think he wrote it in the 90s, was to focus on the reactions of the majority when there is success. And it really was the first time that I saw somebody really try to think through, okay, first of all, to define what success is problematic. But within it, the analogy is about a law school faculty, and they end up having too many African-American professors, and the faculty meetings focus on, well, wait a minute, this is beginning to look like an NBA team. We can't have this many. So that thought process and your point of the impact of success is something I don't think we've spent enough time
Yes.
on. Look forward to your work on that. And Karen, that makes me think of your other world. One of the big blessings for me being in Arizona State now, one is to learn so much about the military. Karen's a combat veteran, so you know there's that combination again. I guess being an athlete and you can get a PhD, being a combat veteran and getting a PhD. But to think about that world, the military and the success or not that's happened there, we do a lot of work with thinking about the military in terms of career transition for athletes versus military people. What lessons, as you reflect on this and you think about your life, I mean, I know it's not the leadership point of that is not necessarily your area of study, but what do you think about in connecting those two worlds?
You know, I have to say, I do come, even though my experience in the military as a woman, especially being a paratrooper, I was one of the few, but I still did live that military experience with some privilege that maybe, you know, there were some blinders, because I really feel like the way my path through the military is, you know, it's what's on your collar that matters, right? So it's your rank, you respond to leadership, and my leaders from basic training all the way through were women of color and people of color. And I felt, you know, fortunate to have that. But now when I talk to some of my veterans in some of my circles, especially women of color who had some leadership positions, they definitely opened my eyes to some of the same, issues, that like when I went through jump school, if I had failed, it would have been, see, women can't be paratroopers. It wouldn't have just been Private Pittenger failed. It would have been women failed. And I hear some of that from some of the women of color who were in leadership positions in the military as well. And I think about, timely enough, Ruth Bader Ginsburg talking about when will you think there will be enough women? Like, what is the number that there's been enough women on the Supreme Court? And she says, well, when all of them are women, because none of you had a problem when all of them were men. So I think about it in those terms. Yeah.
That's good. I like
Keith,
that.
Keith, I want to give you a chance to jump in, and then Sam come back. Then I want to open up for any final thoughts that people have. Keith, what are you reflecting on now? I know you've got a lot in your head on this.
No, I just love to learn and and just honored to be a part of it. So 3 thoughts. One, we need to hire our own, specifically the college institutions. By own, I mean black, white, brown, gay, straight, gender, fluidity, however you want to frame it. So I'm going to give a shout out to, when I was a young coach from 90 to 95 at Shields College and working on my master's and doctorate, I met a guy named Gene Boyd. Gene Boyd played at Arizona State. He transferred from our junior college where he was our MVP. And he played, had a cup of coffee with the Patriots. Then he went to NFL Europe, bounced around. All these folks cut him. He was a really good player. But he said, what do I do? He called me up. I said, get your master's in higher ed, start at the bottom, like Drake. Now he's here. Gene has started at the bottom. He's moved all the way up to the 2nd floor. He's the #2 deputy chief of staff. I lose track what his titles are. But he's been living in Arizona since 1991. Reports to Ray Anderson. Why can't we take that case study and replicate it for all student athletes, but particularly Gene's biracial, white mother, black father, but for men of color? It works. They get degrees. They're smart. They can add value. They can add diverse perspectives. So I just think we need to look at the pool right there. And I want to give Dr. Lapchick, his work, when I read his book, when I was working on my doctor, 5 minutes to midnight. Are we at 6 minutes now, 7, or are we at 3, 2, or 1? I'll let everyone think about that. And then I got to give Doc Edwards a shout out. I was rewatching one of his YouTube talks, and he always says there are no final victories at the interface of race, sport, and society. There are no final victories. It is so sad to grow up one generation removed from 2 parents that grew up in segregated Texas, raised me in LA, and to just, recently I was home with my mother. My dad passed almost 2 years ago. May he rest in peace. They were married 55 years. But to see my mother have to relive the same things that people from the civil rights era have grown up with, it is just sad to see the lack of accountability, whether it's Breonna Taylor. I mean, we're fighting the same battle. So to those that are interested in a better country, why are we fighting the same battles?
So of course we're running up against the clock, and I don't know what the technology is going to do to us, but Sam, if you could give us a minute, then Richard, I'm going to ask you to give the final word, whatever thoughts you want to make sure we go away with, and then we'll ask Kendall to come back on. So Sam, give you 60 seconds.
Yeah, quickly, I just want to tell everybody that there are still things happening. I've been in communication with the NCAA, the president, Mark Emmert, Mark Lombardi, the chair of the subcommittee, the diversity subcommittee. We're going to ask them to bring forward a recommendation that they adopt a Rooney Rule. The West Coast Conference, Gloria Navarez has adopted the Bill Russell Rule. Jason Belzer with Athletic U has gotten 30 athletic directors to sign on to also do a pledge to do the same thing. We have to continue to push forward. My focus right now is the NCAA. I believe they can make this happen like they did with the Confederate flag and force schools to adopt a Bill Russell Rule. We have a pledge, that a petition that we'd like everyone to sign and share, and really send your voice and your letters to the NCAA. Do not let the NCAA off the hook. There is more that they can do. And also, Dr. Lapchick said he's working with the conferences. We need to go after the conferences, the presidents, the athletic directors, and the NCAA. We can make this happen. And again, there is no other time that we've ever had or will ever have again. It's important for student athletes, specifically of color, to mobilize, use your voice and your power to make this happen. We are here to support you, and we can do this. And now is the time.
Dr. Lapchick, please send us off, and then Kendall will come back on.
Well, you know, I think the people who are gathered here discussing this are people who've been on the front lines. I'm lucky enough to work with Doc Harrison almost every day. Dr. Hill and I have been colleagues. You and I have known each other for a long time. Sam and I have done a lot together. Karen, this is my first time meeting you, but obviously you've been in the game. I don't think everybody can be on the front lines, but everybody's got to get off the sidelines. It's too important a moment in American history for us not to be pushing forward to get as much accomplished and to pay attention to where all these pitfalls lie and attack them.
Well, thank you, everybody. I love all you guys. I guess I can't say that to Karen because I work with her, but really, continue the struggle and yeah, say her name, Breonna Taylor. Kendall.
All right.
Love you.
Thank you all so much. So we're just going to ask our attendees to hang on. We've got a little bit more information for you, but thank you, outstanding panelists. This was a conversation. I know that we kind of went through things very quickly. It's definitely scratching the surface, thinking about a wider conversation. And that kind of leads me to dismissing you all. I'm sure that you have a lot going on. So please, if you need to exit, please do. But for our attendees, we wanted to show you a bit of our new issue that we have. So Crystal, if you wouldn't mind sharing your, perfect. So once again, this conversation, this GSM Live, this whole issue is inspired by the work that our research is doing that Karen shared with us in the first segment, the reset of college sport, the field study that obviously examines Power 5 conference, looking at Division I head football coaches, hirings, firings over the last decade. In this issue, you're gonna see lots of different inspired stories coming from not only that data, but looking at other sorts of areas that are happening across college sports. So we wanted to give you a quick snapshot here, and in the actual chat box, you can see the link to peruse. Please read, share. Like I said, this is our first look just for you all. It's officially, you know, opening up for everybody tomorrow, but we will be talking about this, having further conversations. This is definitely an ongoing conversation that so many voices need to be added to. Dr. Lapchick said it perfectly. Not all of us can be on the front lines, but we certainly have to get off the sidelines. And if there's anything that's to be said, you know, justice for those lives lost, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, you know, George Floyd, and so many others. The fight continues, and it's not just up to some of us, it's up to all of us to be a part of that change. So please check out the reset of college sport, continuing the conversation. We will be sharing news and things like that from our social media. So thank you again to the panelists for a really inspiring conversation, and we'll leave it there. And until next time, thank you all for joining us for our Global Sport Matters, the reset of college sport.
Thank you, everybody.
Doc, love you, man. I hope to see you again soon in person. Take care.
Much love, everybody.